My thoughts have been changing as the protest went along. As it took a violent turn, I was also threatened by some protesters. They were threatening to go around me if I don't stop what I'm doing. My last resort would be to run into my apartment building. That was actually the game changer for me. People are so ethnocentric about who is a Hong Konger and who is not a Hong Konger, and who is entitled to an opinion and who is not. No, I'm not an outsider. I've been nearly hurt by protesters. My studies was deeply affected by the protest, and I have my own thoughts about it.
We've actually discussed the Hong Kong protest back when I was in high school, and we've always been encouraged to read from both sides of the spectrum. I learned that there's so much more to the Hong Kong protest than just protesters being attacked and assaulted. There are also people who can't go to work, people who are being attacked even though they're not a protester. It's not just these protesters being oppressed, it's also this other side of like the elderly who can't go anywhere.
A lot of countries have national security laws. Also, the Philippines outlaws violent protests. If, as much as possible, we can be more level headed and don't resort to violent attacks, then I think we can be talking a bit more peacefully and productively.
Kamusta ka? It's Key Bros. Welcome to a new episode of Soft Talk, where unlike BBC's Hard Talk, the interviewees won't find it hard to talk.
So before we start today's video, make sure to subscribe to Key Bros by pressing the red button below, and also like the video by giving it a thumbs up.
So today we're very honored to have two guests from the Philippines. They're Amanda and RJ.
Could Amanda and RJ briefly introduce yourselves for our audience?
So hi, I'm Amanda. I'm from the Philippines. I was born and raised here around Metro Manila, and I attended local school and international school in the Philippines. And I've also studied in China over the summers. And I'm also half Chinese. So a lot of my relatives came from China about 4 generations back. I'm really happy to be here and share my opinions on China and my experiences based on my perception of Hong Kong here in the Philippines.
Hi everyone, my name is RJ. I'm a PhD candidate in Hong Kong Baptist University. As for my upbringing, well, I was educated traditionally in the Philippines. So public school and then Catholic school and then a non-sectarian university for my bachelor's. And then for my master's, it's another Catholic university. I decided to go here to Hong Kong to do my own research. And finally, I fell in love with the place. Hong Kong is a really fascinating place. It's like an onion that you just keep on peeling and away all these layers.
Maraming salamat. So without further ado, let's begin with the first question. So what are your thoughts on the Hong Kong protests in general?
I will state the obvious, it's a really complex issue. There's a lot of gray areas, but my thoughts have been changing as the protest went along. When it was still a peaceful protest, the marches in June, I was thoroughly captivated by the unity. And I thought, oh, this is a peaceful protest. I hope that it can actually make some changes. When I arrived here in Hong Kong, it's so easy to be stunned by all the facade that Hong Kong offers you. Hong Kong is an extremely well-developed city, but also there's a lot of social problems that have been pervading Hong Kong for a long time. Housing problems, and also the huge gap between the rich, not to mention middle class also. But as it took a violent turn, I was also threatened by some protesters. I was documenting some of the protests in my area and just making sure that I capture the backside of the protesters. And then some protesters were pointing at me, saying in Cantonese that, oh, that guy is taking a picture, don't document what we're doing. They were threatening to go around me if I don't stop what I'm doing. My last resort would be to run into my apartment building. That was actually the game changer for me. Yes, I understand that the violence was coming from this passion and intense emotion that most young people and millennials have against the city government and the Chinese government. But at the same time, rights is also a very complex issue because whose right is more important? My right to do whatever I want or your right to protest? These are really difficult questions. I don't think there's a right answer for that. But one thing that I know is if as much as possible we can be more level-headed and don't resort to violent attacks, then I think we can be talking a bit more peacefully and productively.
We've actually discussed the Hong Kong protest back when I was in high school, and we've always been encouraged to read from both sides of the spectrum because I've also been educated in China. I can understand a bit more of some Chinese media media. So I've read from Western media like the New York Times and the BBC, but I've also read South China Morning Post and the Chinese media. So at school, and the general perception of people around me were that the protesters did have some reasons to be a little violent, because we're taught that that's called direct violence, which stems from not only the laws that Hong Kong has been enacting, but also perhaps because of the housing crisis and other structural problems Hong Kong has been experiencing, which probably accumulated at the point when you had the extradition bill. And this is kind of viewed from our end as the last straw for Hong Kong's people, which encouraged them to have that sort of violence. We also believe that the police violence is also not something that we should say is right. However, because the protesters are violent in a sense, it's also something that the Hong Kong police may have thought they've had to do just to keep the peace for other civilians. Generally, I think most people around me have had a neutral stance to a more pro-protester stance, just because they feel like perhaps the people have been dissatisfied with the government, but we don't believe that it's only because of the extradition bill.
It's very interesting. This next question is directed to RJ because you were at Hong Kong during the protests. Did you have friends here in Hong Kong who had actively participated in the movement? And did you find it difficult to have civil discussions with those who heavily sympathize with the protesters?
Friends of mine joined the protest, not in the front lines though. They joined the peaceful marches. But when it got violent, they also became doubtful if they should actually participate or not, given all the violence that has been happening. Not just at night, actually, even in the morning, there's a lot of violence going on. One thing my friends and I have been debating is that they keep on labeling me as an outsider. Sure, I'm not a Hong Kong citizen, but my personal life was affected by the protest. I've been nearly hurt by protesters. My studies was deeply affected by the protest, and I have my own thoughts about it. And I was here when it happened. So I keep on disagreeing. No, I'm not an outsider in what happened. I might be an outsider in terms of legal citizenship and residency rights. Sure, I am an outsider. Linguistically, I understand very little Cantonese. That way, I am an outsider. But the thing is, Hong Kong prides itself as a very multicultural society. That's one contradiction that I've been having with my friends, and something that the Hong Kong protest has actually managed to surface quite well. People are so ethnocentric about who is a Hong Konger and who is not a Hong Konger, and who is entitled to an opinion and who is not.
The Philippines has officially stayed neutral on the Hong Kong SCR national security law. Do you see the law as necessary? In addition, President Duterte of your country has recently passed an anti-terrorism law. Do you support it as well? And are there any similarities or differences between the two laws?
For the Hong Kong national security law, if it's necessary or not, I do think it was. In its current form, that is extremely vague, maybe not. A lot of countries have national security laws. If we look at, for example, Philippines, even if there's no national security law, there's a terrorism law. I'm not saying that the protesters here are terrorists, but also the Philippines outlaws violent protests. I would advocate a law that governs this kind of expression, but not in a very vague way that in the current form now. As for the Philippines, we had a very similar law that was enacted this year, which is the anti-terror law. Personally, I don't agree with it, because we already have an existing law that addresses terrorism. This was enacted like 10, 15 years ago, and the UN actually has a good impression on that law. The new one that the Duterte government passed is also really broad, because we also don't know if critiquing the government or protesting or just marching on the streets is an act of terrorism. There's been a lot of debates on that, with some officials saying, no, protesting is not. And then some other hardliners are saying, oh, the moment you disagree with the government, you're actually inciting violence. So those are the two sides, I think. But to me, I really don't agree with laws that are really vague and are so malleable that is prone to being abused by authorities.
Now, let's move on to the next question, which is directed at Amanda. As an outside observer of the Hong Kong situation from your vantage point in Manila, how did the media coverage shape your perception of the protests? And has the Filipino media been objective in their coverage? If not, how did you manage to form an independent opinion on Hong Kong?
Media that I usually see as a Filipino in the Philippines, I think it is a little biased. I noticed we've always had a sort of Western media bias. So a lot of the initial coverage I saw was mostly the violence. Most of the headline photos were the protesters being attacked, so people being bruised. Or one I distinctly remember is the man in the subway with all of these cuts on the back. But there weren't a lot of discussions or photos of, for example, the police being attacked. And I realized that the media really didn't have a lot of this side of Hong Kong. It's because of my friends from Hong Kong or my friends from China who knew this other side that I learned that there's so much more to the Hong Kong protest than just protesters being attacked and assaulted. There are also people who can't go to work, people who are being attacked even though they're not a protester. So I remember during the start of the protest, I was messaged by one of my friends and he showed me some media coverage from China. So I learned about this other extreme. He showed me a Bilibili video of Hong Kong civilians being attacked, and he would translate a bit of the Chinese subtitles to me. I was appalled because I didn't realize that in my initial perception that it's not just these protesters being oppressed, it's also this other side of like the elderly who can't go anywhere or people who can't go to work. One of my friends was actually there in an internship and he told me he had to go on this entirely new route just because of that. I think it is only because of my exposure to an international education and also my politics class when I took the international baccalaureate that really encouraged me to look on both extremes and really try to look as much as possible from a place of neutrality, because I think a lot of media really encourages you to just look at the headline and then stop there instead of read the article. My friends, I think initially a lot of them are similar to RJ. At the beginning, they thought that peaceful protests are okay to encourage an improvement of the government. But as the protests went on, I realized people were getting disinterested of supporting the protesters. They wanted to support human rights. But as the protests winded on, it seemed like it was so complicated to protect the rights of the protesters while protecting the rights of other people. Some students decided to stop following the news. And I feel like that's really sad because they were upset that the media that they were seeing day to day was mostly just from the side of the protesters instead of showing, for example, the reasons why they're protesting or showing the other side. I feel like media lacks a little more depth in terms of the coverage.
There was an unfortunate Manila hostage crisis back in 2010, which resulted in the death of certain Hong Kong tourists after they were kidnapped by a former Filipino police officer. So the Filipino government at the time under Aquino III was widely criticized here in Hong Kong for its incompetence in dealing with the crisis. So what are your views on this incident?
I think our president at the time didn't even apologize. He said he refused to apologize for what happened. And I think that's something I don't support. It's not his fault, but I feel like if people from Hong Kong were here in our land and they were kidnapped by a Filipino policeman, it's still under his jurisdiction to an extent. I feel like he could have maybe apologized to the Hong Kong people, because I know that he cannot make up for those lives, but he can sympathize better. Because if I were family members with somebody who was kidnapped or killed, I think the least I could want is sympathy from the president. I think an apology from the president would have made this unfortunate situation a lot more acceptable to deal with. And I think it's also the president's responsibility because it does affect our relations with Hong Kong to an extent because of the perceptions of the people and also the government as well. It might be seen as mishandling.
I was actually in the uni when that happened, and the uni was less than a kilometer away from the hostage crisis site. Even if you're not there, you can see everything live. To me, apology is a bit contentious because if he apologizes, it's effectively saying, oh, we messed it up without proper investigation. But I think what Aquino could have done better is to express what he wants to do in a more sympathetic way. Like, we promise that we will do everything that we can to investigate this fully and make sure that the victims are rightly compensated. Once the studies and the investigations are finished, he could have said that the erring policemen who were on the scene and did not act accordingly would have been dealt with. Because we know that the hostage taker was actually killed on that day. So the only thing that we can look at is, can the police and the negotiators handle this incident better? And also, I think he should have made proposals on how to go forward, because apparently at that time, we came to know that Philippines doesn't have any formal training for negotiations for the police. So there could have been policy changes. We could have introduced course for the police on how to negotiate. And that would have been a better apology, because at the end of the day, sorry is just a word. More important is what you do after you say sorry.
Now let's move on to the last question. This is directed at RJ again. How does the way of life here in Hong Kong stack up to the Philippines? And considering the tense political climate here in Hong Kong, would you still consider staying in Hong Kong in the long run? And what do you think is the most significant prejudicial misunderstanding that people here in Hong Kong tend to have of the Philippines, given that most Filipinos here are domestic helpers?
Life in the Philippines and life in Hong Kong are extremely different. One thing that made me fall in love with Hong Kong is efficiency. In Philippines, you start with the transport system. It's just extremely inefficient. The ease of moving around is probably the thing that actually made me so comfortable here because I can go wherever I want. But not just that, actually, because Hong Kong has a good healthcare system. Compared to the Philippines, where people just die queuing up in the hospitals or clinics, in Hong Kong, public healthcare system is actually really good. I actually felt I was taken care of really well in Hong Kong because I also have some medical conditions to attend to. And in the Philippines, I have to shell out my money for that. In Hong Kong, it's all subsidized by the government, and that just made me work extra hard on my studies because I can feel that there are chances for me to take care of myself better. In terms of standards of living, of course, some stuff in Hong Kong are just really expensive, like housing. The price that I'm paying for my housing unit here in Hong Kong, I could have gotten a 2-bedroom exquisite unit in Manila already. It's also my first time to live alone in my life because in the Philippines, if you're not married, then you're expected to stay with your family, just like in Hong Kong, actually. That was also a big adjustment for me when I came here. But then again, because you can find everything in Hong Kong, it's just really easy to deal with everything. My perception with Hong Kong when I arrived here is it's really glitzy and glamorous. It's just full of life in Mong Kok or in Sham Shui Po. I love the feeling. But then again, once you investigate a little more, then you will see all the social problems that Hong Kong have. So much so that I don't actually believe that Hong Kong is a melting pot. It's not a soup, it's a salad. You can see all the individual ingredients. South Asians are present in Sham Shui Po only at night. You don't see them in the morning. It's all locals in the morning. So they might not be spatially segregated, but they are temporally segregated. You can only see Filipino domestic workers on Sunday or public holiday, but otherwise they're just staying at home. Everyone has their own time to go out, and this is the way Hong Kong segregates everyone in terms of time. Once the violence started happening, I also started to think about my fellow countrymen here, most of whom are vulnerable domestic workers. And I know some domestic workers because I did some field work, and they tell me, oh, some of my friends, they were fired because the employers still enforce the curfew, even if there's a protest. They have to be at home like 10 or 11 p.m. A couple of them were stuck in Hong Kong Island. Their employer is in new territories and there's no transportation available. And the next day they were fired. These are the things that made me feel I know a lot of Hong Kong people are kind, but there are also a lot of Hong Kong people who are treating their employees bad. That was really inhumane and just lacking compassion. What I think of the Hong Kong protest is with all the violence and all the social changes that have been happening, it tends to bring out not just the best of Hong Kong people, but also the worst. Because you see both people can unite to achieve whatever they want, but also it's a very class-centric phenomenon that tends to forget those who are outside the middle class.
Maraming salamat. Here is the end of part 1. In part 2, we'll be discussing the South China Sea dispute between China and the Philippines, and also the recent warming relations between the two countries under the Duterte administration. So please stay tuned. All right, so see you guys in the next episode. Bye.